Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about adoption and Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Zainab. To begin, the five topics I want to discuss: how Prophet Muhammad married Zainab and how adoption got abolished, ancient cultures in adoption, difficulties with adopting in Islam, why did Prophet Muhammad marry his daughter-in-law, did Muhammad fall in love with Zainab, and how adoption became forbidden with Zayd and Zainab. The first topic is ancient cultures and adoption. Looking at history, we know adoption was a common practice in many cultures. It's something good to do, adopting someone is like making them your son or daughter. They become part of your family. They take your name, they inherit from you, they become part of the family. There's many examples, ancient Roman culture, elite Romans used to adopt children and they became part of the family. Sometimes the adopted son would even have a higher status than the natural born son. This is because the adopted son was chosen, whereas the natural son was just born with however he was, right? A very famous example is Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. They had a child and Julius also had an adopted son. Guess who became the next leader of the Roman Empire? The adopted son. The adopted son became Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. This is because he was adopted by Julius and he was given the empire. So this is kind of amazing that this is how, in ancient culture, adopted sons and daughters were treated. They were treated like their own child, and they would get everything that the parent would have: the customers, the respect, the privilege, the family name. They were given the honor of being like an actual child. In fact, Julius Caesar, his adopted son became the emperor, not his natural son. The same thing in pre-Islamic Arabia. Sometimes pre-Islamic Arabia, Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance as it's called, is sometimes looked down upon, but there was many good things in pre-Islamic Arabia. For example, Tabari mentions that in accordance with the Arabic custom of adoption at the time, Zayd ibn Haritha was thereafter known as Zayd ibn Muhammad and was a freed man, regarded socially and legally as Muhammad's son. So before Islamic law changed with the marriage of Zainab and Prophet Muhammad, adoption was a very normal process in pre-Islamic Arabia, so much so that they would take the name of, Zayd was actually called Zayd, the son of Muhammad. Muhammad actually adopted him and he took his name, his family name. And why did this all change? We'll get to that. I want to talk about practically difficulties with adoption in Islam. Yusra Goma, in an article titled "Why Adoption and Fostering Must Be Our Muslim Duty" in April 2016 wrote, So basically she was writing an article about adoption in Islam and how difficult it is. She did some interviews and research and she says, when I asked whether Muslim children frequently came into the system, the adoption system, she was told that they did, but they were amongst the most difficult children to match into homes because of the unique religious and cultural needs. I made similar inquiries in Michigan, Washington, Indiana, and Wisconsin only to hear the same response, that they were the most difficult children to match. It's very hard for a Muslim family to adopt, and let's discuss why. The first reason is because of mahram issues. Mahram is basically the laws of blood, meaning when you're mahram to someone, you're allowed to be alone with them. You can hug them, kiss them, you're mahram to your mother, you're mahram to your father. You can basically be alone with them. They're like family members, and you cannot marry your mahram. The thing is, when you adopt, that child is not mahram to you. So if you adopt a girl, like if I adopted a daughter, I wouldn't be able to be alone with her. I can actually marry her, right? It's not considered an actual adoption because adoption is not allowed. So what would happen is that girl would just be a part of the family, but she would kind of be like a stranger in the family. As well, how can you get around this? I actually know, one individual who wanted to adopt a child, one family. And so what they did was, in order to adopt this little boy, the mom tried to, like the adopted mom tried to take some sort of herbal medicines to try to get some breast milk so they could feed the baby, because you can become a foster mom in Islam, and then the child would be mahram to you. Because this didn't actually work, the second option they did was to get her sister to breastfeed the child, even though the child was done breastfeeding, and obviously it was a foster child that was being adopted. By her sister breastfeeding, it became kind of like a relative, and she became like an auntie to the child. So this is kind of like the workarounds you have to go through in order to have an actual child in your family that's related to you, or so-called related to you, right? And you can imagine how difficult this is and how problematic it is. And so many Muslims, they don't want to, because when the child grows up, what would they do, right? And they don't always have these workarounds available, right? Very strange that you have to do this. As well, the adopted son or daughter doesn't take the name of the family name. The adopted son has to be known as this child has his own name. And we'll get to the story of how this happened. But basically, this is a very serious thing in Islam, so serious that it's punishable by hell. I'm going to read a hadith narrated in Bukhari and Muslim. It was narrated from Abu Dhar, may Allah be pleased with him, that he heard the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, say, "There is no man who knowingly calls himself after someone other than his father, but he has committed kufr, disbelief. Whoever claims to belong to people of whom he has no ties of blood, let him take his place in hell." This is a very serious point. Taking a child, giving a child your name, it's strangely serious. It's very strange, that a child cannot take your family name. Adopted son or daughter does not get inheritance. That's another thing. The rules of inheritance are fixed in the Quran, that this person gets this much, this person gets this much, a son gets one amount, and a daughter would get half of what the son gets. But the adopted child would not get anything. Now, there is 1/3 allowance that you can be flexible with, so you would have to specify that from the 1/3, give my adopted son this amount. Otherwise, the adopted child would not get any inheritance from the family, which is again quite a sad thing. Compare this to the pre-Islamic, method that the child would inherit, would be like an actual child. Does it seem like Islam actually raised the rights, increased the rights of adopted children? No, it actually took away rights that they had before Islam. And many Muslims are not aware that this whole thing actually happened because of Prophet Muhammad wanting to marry Zainab. Now, why did Prophet Muhammad marry his daughter-in-law? This was something that was considered taboo, forbidden in pre-Islamic society. So much so that Prophet Muhammad was scared to tell people that he was going to marry Zainab. It says in the Quran, in chapter 33, verse 37, "And you fear the people, while Allah has more right that you fear Him." Meaning Prophet Muhammad was scared about this. He was scared to do this, but he wanted to do it. Zayd was just like Muhammad's son. Zayd was his adopted son, and he was part of the family. He loved Prophet Muhammad very much so, and Prophet Muhammad loved Zayd very much as well. In fact, Zayd is the only the only companion mentioned by name in the Quran. He has that high a status and that much love Prophet Muhammad had for him. So Prophet Muhammad got Zayd married to Zainab. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. They had some troubles. She was an attractive young lady of the tribe of Quraysh. Aisha said, from amongst the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, Zainab was my peer in beauty and in love that she received from the Prophet. This is narrated in Bukhari. So it was well known she was a beautiful young lady. They got married around the age of 35. In fact, the law of hijab was revealed on the wedding night of Prophet Muhammad to Zainab. So before that, there was no law of hijab. When he married Zainab, the same night, the law of hijab was revealed. The story goes that when the waiting period of Zainab was over, meaning Zayd had divorced Zainab, and there was a waiting period in Islam to know whether she's pregnant or not. And once the waiting period was over, Zayd went to Zainab and told her that Prophet Muhammad has sent a marriage proposal for you. Zainab replied, I won't do anything until I talk to my Lord, meaning God. She went to pray, and while she was praying, the Quran was revealed, and then the Messenger of Allah came and entered upon her without any formalities, and this is narrated in Sahih Muslim. So basically, she was praying, she was asking God, should I marry him? Maybe she was worried, what will people say about me? What's going to happen if I marry this man who is my my father-in-law, essentially, right? She was like a daughter to him, right? So maybe she was thinking about this, and while she was thinking about this and praying, Prophet Muhammad walked right into her home and said, I'm your husband. It's interesting. Why was there a need for Prophet Muhammad to demonstrate this rule of marrying your ex-wife of your adopted son? Is this something that really needed demonstrating? Why would you even want to marry your daughter-in-law? I mean, my father and my wife, he treats my wife like he used to treat my wife like his daughter. She was like, he used to call her Betty, like, daughter. It's just weird and strange. Like, why would you want to marry your daughter, like someone that's like your daughter to you? Like, do people do this? Like, is this a common thing that Allah needed to reveal a verse about this and tell everybody forever and ever? Now, it said on one Islamic site, it says the reason for the revelation of these verses was that Allah wanted to prescribe a law for all believers that adopted sons did not come under the same rulings as real sons in any way, and there's nothing wrong with those who wanted to adopt them, who had adopted them, from marrying their wives after divorce. So basically, Allah wanted to ensure that all the Muslims would know forever and ever until the day of judgment, that if one day your adopted son has a wife, and he divorces his wife, you can marry her, just in case she might be an attractive lady, young lady, you never know, maybe you want to marry her, and what's the best way of showing this? For Muhammad to marry his own daughter-in-law who is attractive young lady. So what, now we know. I mean, this is great. I mean, this is a great thing, if ever it happens again. Now, did Muhammad fall in love with Zainab? This is an interesting story. I always used to think this was a completely weak hadith and fabricated story, but after looking into it and doing some research, I found out that this is actually considered a pretty solid story. The earliest tafsir, Ibn Ishaq, didn't unfortunately mention much about the wives of Prophet Muhammad. But the next one that we have, which is Ibn Sa'd, who died in 230 after the Hijrah, mentions the story as follows. So Prophet Muhammad went to visit Zayd, and Zayd wasn't home. So then Zainab answered the door, and she said, Zayd is not here, why don't you come in? Prophet Muhammad, turned away, and he muttered some things. He said some things under his breath, and he left. Now when Zayd came back, Zainab mentioned what happened, and she said that Prophet Muhammad came, and Zayd asked her, why didn't you let her in? And she said, I did invite him in, but he turned away and he said, Subhanallah al-Azim, Subhanal Musarriful Qulub, which basically means, glory to Allah the Great, the one that changes the hearts. So Zayd, he understood what this meant, and he said that Prophet Muhammad had feelings for Zainab, that he was attracted to her. So he went to Prophet Muhammad, and he said, Zayd had some issues with his marriage to Zainab. It seems like Zainab was not happy marrying Zayd, who was an ex-slave basically, and she wanted someone of higher status. Now the interesting thing is that it seemed that Prophet Muhammad had liked her from this story, and this was mentioned in Ibn Sa'd. So after this happened, Zayd asked for permission to divorce Zainab. He no longer wanted to be married to Zainab. So what did he do? He couldn't bear after this to be married to Zainab, and he asked Prophet Muhammad over and over again, can I divorce her? And Prophet Muhammad said no. And this is where the verse came in, and you feared the people while Allah has more right that you fear him. So the verse was revealed discussing this. Eventually Zayd couldn't take it and he divorced Zainab, and then, as you know, Allah revealed the verse that Muhammad got married to Zainab. Now, is this an authentic story? Like the earliest reference we have is Ibn Sa'd, as I mentioned, in 210 after the Hijrah, who mentioned this story. And then Muqatil, actually even before that, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, who was actually the earliest tafsir, even before Ibn Sa'd, mentioned this story. This is in 150 after the Hijrah. But this tafsir is not considered reliable. However, Tabari, who died in 310 after the Hijrah. He's considered the greatest scholar of tafsir. He's the most orthodox, the most authentic. He's considered the encyclopedia of tafsirs, the bastion of Sunnah, of Sunni tafsirs. And he mentions this story that Prophet Muhammad was, had feelings for Zainab. He mentions this, and he narrated this from Ibn Zayd and Qatada, who was a student of Ibn Abbas. Also, other than Tabari, Tafsir Samarkandi, Talabi, Zamarakshi, Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, they all mention the same story. That, and why is this a big problem? The problem is, it's a big problem because it seems that Prophet Muhammad, he had feelings for someone, and then, the next thing that happened was he ended up marrying her, and Allah married her to him. And it seems troubling, It's also interesting that in the later centuries, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, this story became very, very frowned upon. And Ibn Kathir even says that some of the earlier books have reports we would rather not mention. And Ibn Hajar, who died 852 after Hijrah, doesn't even mention the story. Later on, scholars went even further to say this early story is a complete fabrication, and it was made by the evil Orientalists, like conspiracy theories. And all of this is mentioned by Yasir Qadhi in his Seerah lecture, that all of these references which I mentioned. So to conclude the story, to conclude this video, adoption became forbidden after Prophet Muhammad after Zayd divorced Zainab, because before that, they used to call him Zayd ibn Muhammad, and this was something that was considered completely taboo, to marry your adopted son's ex-wife. To marry your daughter-in-law was considered taboo, because a son was considered like a real son. So in order to make this marriage not as controversial, adoption had become forbidden, and you were not allowed to call anyone by the name. So in order to marry Zainab, all of the goodness that came from adoption was completely eliminated. I mean, why else would it be that adoption was eliminated at this timely point when Prophet Muhammad wanted to marry Zainab? It's interesting that both of these things happened at the same time. And it's also interesting that if adoption is forbidden now, and Muslims cannot adopt or take the name, why go through all of this? Why would Prophet Muhammad even need to show people? I mean, we can't even adopt anymore. So why would you need to have this big hoopla about just so you should marry her, so that no one would have any trouble, none of the believers would have trouble to marry the adopted son's ex-wife? For the final revelation of God to include such a strange thing, doesn't it just seem troubling? Doesn't it seem strange that in the final revelation sent to mankind, that you would need to include such an obscure rule? And isn't it troubling that this beautiful young lady that Prophet Muhammad liked, that he had to come up with moral justification to marry her from Allah? That if it wasn't for this, he could never marry her, and people would talk bad about him and say that, look at this man, he's marrying his daughter-in-law? I mean, these are just some things to think about. I think I went a little bit longer than I wanted to. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and to keep up with my other videos. And as well, please check out my other video about Muhammad's revelations that he received for marrying his other wives. Thank you very much.